The line at the cider stand curled past the hay bales stacked for the pumpkin toss, past the 4-H booth with its ribbons flapping in the September wind, and still it kept growing. Folks stood patient in their barn coats, talking low, holding their empty mason jars like they were waiting on communion. Up ahead, behind a plank table he'd built himself from an old barn door, the veteran worked a hand-cranked press with the same unhurried rhythm he brought to everything. Turn, pour, wipe the spout, turn again. He didn't call out to the crowd. He didn't need to. 30 yards away, under a banner that read, "Fresh from the Valley's finest orchard" in gold cursive, the big orchard's fruit table sat mostly untouched. Baskets of glossy red apples were stacked in perfect pyramids, price cards laminated and precise, a folding sign advertising free samples that nobody seemed to want. A young woman in an orchard polo shirt kept rearranging the same 3 baskets, glancing over her shoulder at the crowd gathered elsewhere. Kurt stood near the edge of that table, arms crossed over his flannel jacket, jaw tight. He wasn't behind the counter anymore. Not exactly. He'd been the one setting up the display since dawn, directing the delivery trucks, straightening the banner twice. Foreman of the county's biggest orchard now, a job he'd taken pride in for 3 years. But his eyes kept drifting to that other line, the one that shouldn't have existed at all. He remembered the trees. Christ, he remembered the trees. Gray bark peeling like old paint, branches twisted with canker, half the orchard looking like it belonged in a ghost story rather than a harvest catalog. He'd told the old man himself, plain as day, standing in that same rot-smelling grove 3 years back. Cut them down, sell the wood, cut your losses before they take the rest of your savings with them. He'd said it kindly enough, he told himself. Practical advice from a man who knew orchards. Now here he was, watching strangers wait 40 minutes for a cup of cider, poured from mason jars with handwritten labels, string tied around the lids like something a grandmother might can back home. The veteran hadn't dressed the stand-up any. No banner, no polo shirts, no laminated signs. Just a folding table, a wash-tub press cobbled together from parts that looked salvaged from 3 different decades, and a line of people who kept coming back for seconds. Kurt uncrossed his arms, then crossed them again. Somewhere behind him, the orchard owner was making small talk with a county official, oblivious or pretending to be. Kurt wasn't fooled. He'd seen enough sales charts this season to know which way the wind blew, and it wasn't blowing toward the gold cursive banner. He watched the old man turn the crank once more, steady as ever, not even glancing up at the crowd he'd drawn. Kurt's stomach turned with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, something closer to the slow, sinking realization that he'd been wrong about those trees from the very first cut of his own judgment, 3 years and a whole lot of pride ago. 3 years and a whole lot of pride ago, the bank auction had smelled like dust and cold coffee, folding chairs set up in a grain elevator office because the county didn't have anywhere better to hold it. The veteran had sat in the back row, hat in his lap, cane hooked over the edge of the chair, listening to the auctioneer read off parcel after parcel, like a man reciting a grocery list nobody wanted to buy. When they got to the 6 acres, the orchard the bank had taken back after the previous owner went under, the room had gone quiet. In that particular way, rooms go quiet when everyone already knows the answer and is just waiting for someone foolish enough to say it out loud. The photographs passed around the room showed trees that looked like something out of a bad dream, bark blackened and split, branches twisted back on themselves like arthritic fingers. Someone near the front had laughed, not unkindly, just the tired laugh of men who'd seen too many bad investments to feel anything else about one more. The auctioneer had barely finished his opening number before the veteran raised his hand. He didn't bid like a man in a hurry. He bid like a man who'd already decided, back in his kitchen at 4 that morning with a cup of black coffee and the deed papers spread out under the lamp, that this was the last decision he had left to make with the money he had left to spend. His wife had been gone 3 years by then, and the house felt too big and too quiet, and a man could only stare at a folded flag on a shelf for so long before he needed something living to put his hands to. Nobody bid against him. Nobody wanted to. He signed the papers in a back office, with a banker, who kept glancing at him like he expected the old man to change his mind before the ink dried. The banker mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the previous owner's foreman was still around, finishing out a few final weeks helping transition equipment, and that the veteran might want to talk to him before hauling out there alone. He remembered walking those rows for the first time 2 days later, canes sinking into soft ground, looking up at trees that seemed less planted than surrendered to. The bark had that sick, blackened look, deep cracks running down trunks that should have still been thick with life. Most men would have seen exactly what Kurt was about to tell him he was seeing: dead wood, wasted money, a mistake dressed up as a bargain. But the veteran had knelt down at the base of one twisted trunk, pressed his thumb into the bark, and felt something underneath that didn't feel finished yet. Something stubborn. Something that hadn't given up just because everyone assumed it had. He'd stood back up, slow, knees complaining, and looked down the long, silent row of trees nobody else wanted, and he'd thought, not for the first time in his life, that quitting on something because it looked ruined was usually just a way of not looking closely enough. Kurt found him there an hour later, boots crunching over frost-hard ground, a clipboard tucked under one arm like a man still guarding property that wasn't his anymore. He didn't offer a hand, just stood at the end of the row, looking at the veteran the way a man looks at someone who's wandered onto the wrong piece of land entirely. "You're the one who bought this," Kurt said. It wasn't a question. The veteran nodded, leaning on his cane, and said he was. Kurt let out a short laugh through his nose, the kind that wasn't really about humor. "Then I guess congratulations are in order. You just paid actual money for a graveyard." He walked a few steps into the row, ran a hand down one blackened trunk like he was inspecting a corpse, and shook his head slow. "This blight's been eating through here 2 seasons now, maybe 3, whole orchards the same story, every row you walk. Bank knew it. That's why they let it go so cheap. Nobody local would touch it." "I noticed the price," the veteran said quietly. "Then you noticed why." Kurt turned to face him fully now, arms crossing over his chest, the clipboard pinned there like a shield. "Look, I've worked this ground 11 years. I know what a sick tree looks like, and I know what a dead one looks like, and these here are dead. Cracked bark, no canopy worth mentioning, half of 'em barely budded last spring, and what did bud dropped before it was worth picking? You want my honest word, since you're new around here and somebody ought to say it plain. Cut 'em down. All of 'em. Sell the wood for firewood, get what you can back out of the deal, and start over with something that'll actually grow. Corn, hay, whatever this dirt's still good for. Because trees, this batch of trees, they're finished." The veteran didn't answer right away. He looked past Kurt, down the long row, at the crooked black shapes standing in the cold, like old men who'd forgotten how to stand up straight but hadn't yet agreed to lie down. "You said half of them budded last spring," he said finally. Kurt frowned. "Didn't hold. I just told you that." "I heard you." The veteran shifted his weight off the bad leg, the one that ached worse in weather like this, and pressed his thumb once more against the bark of the tree nearest him, feeling again that same stubborn firmness underneath the ruin. But budding means the roots are still asking for something. Dead trees don't ask. Kurt's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might argue further, Might list every reason a man who'd spent 11 years walking these rows knew better than a stranger with a cane and a bank receipt. Instead, he just shook his head, muttered something about wasted money and stubborn old fools, and turned back toward the equipment shed, boots crunching away over the frost, leaving the veteran alone again among the twisted, listening trees. The fairground buzzed different that year, the way a hive sounds different right before it swarms. By 10 in the morning, the whisper had already made its way from the funnel cake stand to the judge's table set up under the striped awning near the grandstand. "You seen the line over by the old Ostrowski Place stand?" a woman in a county apron asked, leaning close to the man beside her, who wore a badge that read Harvest Fair Judge in faded gold letters. "Been like that since the gates opened. Folks are walking right past the big table." The judge squinted across the fairground, past the rows of pie contests and the 4-H pens, toward a modest stand made of unpainted planks and a hand-lettered sign. A line of townsfolk stretched from it in a way that didn't make sense for a man selling cider out of mason jars. Near the big orchard's fresh fruit table, polished apples stacked in perfect pyramids under a banner reading County's Finest, since the days before the bank auction, a man in a crisp orchard uniform stood with his arms crossed, watching that same distant line with a face like a held breath. He wore a badge now pinned neat above his shirt pocket. Foreman, stitched in navy thread. The same title he'd once carried at the very orchard that had failed and been sold off at auction years before. Except now it was for a different name, a rival operation 2 counties over that had swallowed up half the small growers left standing. Somehow that badge sat heavier on him than pride should allow. "That the fella who bought the burnt orchard?" one vendor asked another, nodding toward the modest stand. "Blighted trees," folks said, the second vendor answered, adjusting crates of squash. "Everybody said he wasted his pension on firewood." "Don't look like firewood to me," the first vendor muttered, watching another dozen people join the line, cups already in hand from a batch before, faces bright with the particular delight of tasting something they didn't expect to like. The foreman said nothing. He simply watched, jaw tight the way it used to get years ago in the cold, standing among crooked black trees and telling a stubborn old man with a cane that his money was already spent and gone. He remembered the frost, the silence, the way the veteran had pressed his thumb to the bark like he was checking a pulse. He hadn't thought about that morning in a long while, but standing here now, watching that line curl past the hay bales and toward the gate, he found himself thinking of nothing else, of budding branches he'd sworn wouldn't hold, of a phrase that kept surfacing no matter how hard he tried to bury it. "Dead trees don't ask." Beside him, someone from the big orchard's table murmured uneasily about restocking the pie samples, anything to draw a crowd back, but the foreman barely heard it. His eyes stayed fixed on that small, unpainted stand in the distance, where a line of county folks waited patiently for something he'd told a man to burn. The Fairday sun would come later, but that fall, the light had been different, thin and gray, the kind that made the frost linger past noon and the talk at the feed store linger longer than that. The foreman had started it without meaning to make it spread so far. A comment over coffee, a shake of the head at the counter, the kind of thing a man says once and forgets. But in a county that small, words traveled like seed on wind, landing in places he never intended. By the second week of October, the story had grown legs of its own. The old veteran had sunk his savings, what little he had, into 6 acres of rot. Diseased wood, a dead man's orchard, bought by a man who should have known better. At the diner, men who'd never set foot on the property spoke of it like they'd walked every row themselves. They said the bark was black clean through. They said the roots were probably gone too, drowned or starved, and that come spring there'd be nothing left but a windbreak of gray sticks. Someone joked that the veteran ought to sell tickets to watch it burn, and the laughter that followed had the easy cruelty of men who'd never had to gamble everything they had left. The veteran heard it, in pieces, from the mailman, from a neighbor leaning on a fence post, from the way conversations quieted a half-beat too long when he walked into the hardware store. He never answered it. He'd learned long before that explaining yourself to a man who's already decided what he believes only wastes breath better spent on work. But isolation has a way of creeping in through small things. The neighbor who used to wave from his tractor now nodded instead, eyes elsewhere. The invitations to the church supper thinned. Even the bank teller processing his modest transactions asked once, gently but with the particular pity reserved for men considered past saving, whether he'd thought about cutting his losses. He hadn't. He went home instead, past the mailbox with its peeling paint, past the porch where the flag sat folded in its case on the shelf inside, and out to the rows of crooked trees standing black against the coming winter. He ran his palm along the bark, the way another man might check a fevered brow, feeling for something beneath the surface that no one else believed was there. The frost thickened. The gossip did too, and through it all the veteran kept his coat buttoned to the collar, his saw sharpened, his silence steady, waiting, the way he had waited before, for winter to finish its work before he began his. The first hard freeze came in early December, and with it the real work began. He rose before light, the way he had for decades, and dressed in layers that never quite kept the cold from finding the places where metal and scar tissue met bone. His bad leg announced itself each morning with a stiffness that took the better part of an hour to walk out, but he walked it out anyway. Boots crunching frost, breath fogging in the barn where his tools hung in the same order they'd hung the day before. He started at the north end, the row nearest the fence line, because a man learns that beginnings matter less than method. One tree at a time, one branch at a time. He'd study each limb before he cut it, running gloved fingers along the bark, feeling for the give that meant rot clear through, versus the stubborn firmness that meant something underneath was still fighting. The saw was old, the same one he'd used for smaller jobs around the house for years, its teeth resharpened on a stone he kept in his coat pocket like a talisman. Each stroke sent a small ache up through his knee and into his hip, and he let it happen, the way he'd learned to let pain happen without letting it decide anything for him. The neighbors, who still drove past on the county road, saw a bent old man moving slow among crooked trees, cutting away black limbs and hauling them to a growing pile near the barn, and if any of them wondered what he was doing, none stopped to ask. He didn't mind the solitude of it. There was a rhythm in the work that filled the silence better than conversation ever had, the rasp of the saw, the crack of a branch giving way, the soft thud of wood against the frozen ground. Some days the wind cut sideways and stung his face raw. Some days his hands shook from cold before noon. He kept a thermos of coffee in the truck bed and drank it lukewarm, standing between rows, looking down the long avenue of trees he'd cleared, and the longer avenue still waiting. By the second week he had learned the orchard's secrets, the way he'd once learned terrain, where the ground dipped and held water, where the wind came hardest, which trees leaned from years of favoring one side toward the sun. He did not think of them as diseased. He thought of them as wounded, and a wounded thing, in his experience, wasn't the same as a dead one. That distinction had cost him more than once to learn, and he wasn't about to forget it now over a stretch of bark he could still feel breathing beneath his palm. The pile of cut limbs grew tall by the fence. The trees, stripped of their ruined outer growth, stood thinner, starker, more honest in the pale winter light, and he kept moving down the rows, one at a time, waiting for whatever came next to prove him right or wrong. The fairgrounds smelled of fry oil and hay dust, and the line at his stand had gone quiet for a moment, the way a creek quiets between riffles. He used the lull to wipe down the press with a rag he kept tucked in his belt, the wagon wheel gears still faintly warm from the last cranking. That was when the old neighbor stepped up, the same man who'd once leaned on the feed store counter shaking his head at the mention of the orchard, telling anyone who'd listened that the veteran had thrown good money after a graveyard of trees. He didn't say any of that now. He just stood there a moment, hat in his hands, looking at the jars lined up on the plank table like a man unsure how to begin a sentence he'd been carrying a long way. "Didn't figure I'd be back for seconds," the neighbor said finally, setting down his empty cup. The veteran took it without a word of reproach, filled it from the pitcher, and set it back on the table. His hands moved the way they always did, unhurried, certain, the same care he'd once given to the trees themselves. "Glad you found your way to it," he said. The neighbor turned the cup slowly, studying the cider like it might explain itself. "My wife's been asking after this since the market in July. Told her I was the one who said it'd never come to nothing." He gave a short laugh, more at himself than at anything else. "Guess I owe you an apology I didn't figure I'd need to give." "No debts here," the veteran said. "Cider's the same to me whether a man laughed at it or not." The neighbor nodded slowly, like that was answer enough, and drank. Something eased in his shoulders, the kind of easing that comes when a man sets down a thing he'd been carrying without meaning to. Behind him the line had begun to build again, farmers and their wives and a few kids trailing sticky fingers, all waiting their turn at a stand that a year ago hadn't existed, built from a press that hadn't existed, poured from trees that folks up and down the county had sworn were only good for kindling. "Your girl still helping out at the stand?" the veteran asked, mostly to give the man something easy to answer, the way he might have once asked a young private about home to keep his mind off the cold. "Every weekend," the neighbor said, brightening. "Says she wants to learn to work that crank herself." The veteran allowed something close to a smile, the kind that came rarely and cost him nothing to give. "Bring her by," he said. "I'll teach her the turn of it." The neighbor nodded, tipped his hat, and stepped aside to let the next in line step up. And the line, as it always did that day, kept moving, kept growing, a thing with its own patient momentum, the way water finds the low ground it was always meant to fill. The line kept its rhythm, and the veteran let his mind slip back, as it did more often on Fair Day than any other day of the year, to a March morning 3 winters past, when the ground was still hard in the shadows of the barn, but soft where the sun had reached it since noon. He'd been pruning since before Christmas, 1 row at a time, the old saw biting through diseased bark with a sound like tearing canvas. His bad leg propped against the ladder's 2nd rung to take the weight off the knee that never bent right anymore. Most days he worked alone, breath fogging in the cold, hands cracking despite the gloves, and told himself the ache was no different than any other ache he'd carried home from the service, something to work through, not around. By March, the rows he'd finished stood bare and honest, cut back hard, the way an old sergeant had once taught him to cut back anything rotting so the healthy part had room to breathe. He hadn't known, not truly, whether there was a healthy part left. He'd only known Kurt's voice in his head, flat and certain, telling him the trees were finished, and some stubborn thing in his chest that refused to take a man's word for another living thing's death sentence. The first buds came shy, green fists barely cracking on branches he'd spared. He watched them the way he might have watched a wound closing, checking daily, saying nothing to anyone because there was no one close enough to say it to. Then, in the first warm week of April, on a limb he'd almost cut away twice, he found 4 small apples, hard and green still, clinging low where the sun hit longest. He waited. Patience had never cost him anything he wasn't willing to spend. By June, the 4 apples had gone from green to a deep, dull red, smaller than what the big orchard sold, uglier too, scarred along one side where the old blight had left its mark on the skin. He'd cut one open standing right there in the row, expecting nothing, braced for the mealy disappointment Kurt had promised him with such confidence. The flesh inside was dense, pale, almost golden at the core. He'd bitten into it before he'd finished thinking about it, and the sweetness had hit him first, followed by something deeper, tart, then dark, then almost like spice at the back of the tongue, unlike any apple he'd eaten off any tree in the county. He'd stood there a long moment, juice on his chin, the wind moving through bare branches around him, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been clenched since the day he signed the deed. He hadn't told anyone that day either. He'd only walked back to the farmhouse, sat at the kitchen table and started sketching, on the back of an old feed receipt, the crude shape of a press. The sketch on the feed receipt was crude, but it was enough. He knew what a press needed to do: squeeze, and squeeze slow, without tearing the pulp to nothing. And he knew, better than most, that a machine didn't need to be pretty to work. It just needed the right bones. He found those bones in places nobody would have thought to look. The barn gave up 2 thick oak beams from a stall wall long since abandoned, solid despite the years, dense enough to bear real weight. An old wagon rusting behind the machine shed surrendered its wheel, the iron gear still sound beneath the grime, teeth worn but true. The washtub his late wife had used for scrubbing came down from its nail on the porch wall, and he sat with it a long moment before deciding she would rather it be useful than idle. He worked in the evenings, after the day's pruning and feeding were done, when the light went long and orange across the rows, and his knee ached worst from the day's walking. He set the beams as a frame, bolted the wagon gear to a hand crank he shaped from a length of pipe, and fitted the washtub beneath to catch what would come. The first time he turned the crank against a basket of apples, the gear caught wrong and the whole frame lurched sideways, nearly taking his hand with it. He didn't curse. He just looked at it a while, the way he'd once looked at broken things in far worse places, and figured out what it was trying to tell him. Night after night he adjusted it, a wedge here, a tighter bolt there, a leather strap salvaged from an old harness to keep the pressing plate from binding. He tested it on apples not good enough to sell, mashing them to pulp and watching the juice run thin and pale into the tub, then thicker, then slow as syrup as he cranked harder. He learned the machine's temper the way he'd learned a rifle's, the way he'd learned a mule's, not fighting it, just listening for where it wanted to give. By the 4th of July the crank turned smooth, the gear held true, and the juice that dripped from the press ran clear and gold in the evening light, smelling of something he didn't have a word for yet. He caught a little in a jelly jar, held it up to what was left of the sun, and thought of Kurt's voice at the feed store, sure and loud and wrong. He didn't smile. He only screwed the lid on tight and carried it inside, already thinking about labels. The Saturday market opened the way it always did, with the smell of coffee and diesel and the sound of tailgates dropping in the gray early light. He set his card table at the end of the row, past the tomato stands and the honey man, and lined up his mason jars like a man setting soldiers at attention. 12 jars. That was all he had. The labels were his own hand, block letters in pencil pressed hard enough to show through. Orchard cider, small batch. Nothing fancier than that. He didn't have fancy in him, and he didn't trust it in other men either. For the first hour, nobody stopped. A few glanced at the jars, saw the crooked handwriting, and moved on toward the peaches. He didn't call out to them. He'd never been a man to shout for attention, not even when he was young, not even before the leg went bad. He just sat with his cap low and his hands folded, the way he'd waited in worse places for worse things, and let the morning do what it was going to do. An old woman from 2 farms over finally picked one up, turned it in the light, and asked what made cider look like that, dark as tea, not the pale yellow she was used to. He told her the truth. Blighted trees, bad bark, good fruit. She laughed, not unkindly, and bought a jar anyway, more out of pity than faith, he suspected. But she came back the next Saturday with 2 of her sisters, and all 3 left with jars under their arms, and one of them told the postman, and the postman mentioned it to his wife, who ran the front counter at the diner, where Kurt still ate his eggs most mornings. By the 3rd week, strangers were asking for it by name, though it had no name beyond what he'd scratched on the label. A trucker passing through bought 4 jars and said it tasted like something his grandfather used to make before the orchards went corporate. A schoolteacher said it reminded her of an apple she couldn't place, something older, something forgotten. He didn't know what to make of that kind of talk. He only knew the jars kept emptying faster than the week before, and the following Saturday, before he'd even set the last one down, a hand was already reaching for it. He raised the prices a little, not out of greed but arithmetic. 12 jars wasn't enough, and he needed to press twice as much to keep up. Word was doing what word does in small counties, moving quiet, moving sure, moving toward the day it would finally reach the wrong ears. Now, at the fair, the line had stopped being a line and become something closer to a river, bending past the hay bales, past the 4-H pens, past the judging tent where a woman in a county ribbon was still trying to explain to a boy why the biggest pumpkin didn't always win. He stood behind his hand-cranked press with his sleeves rolled and his bad leg propped against a milk crate, and he poured without hurrying, because hurrying had never once made a line move faster, only made a man spill. The big orchard's table sat 40 yards off, draped in a banner that said, "Fresh from the Valley," in letters somebody had paid good money for, baskets of apples stacked into pyramids, so tidy they looked more like a photograph than food. 2 young men in matching caps stood behind it, and for the first 2 hours of the fair they had customers enough, families filling paper sacks, kids biting into apples right there in the aisle. But by mid-morning the current had shifted, the way a creek shifts when something upstream gives way, and the people who had gone to the big table for apples were walking past it now with cups in their hands, cider on their lips, telling the young men in caps that they'd already gotten what they came for. A woman who had once called the orchard a lost cause over a fence post now stood in his line with her daughter, saying to no one in particular that she didn't know what he'd done to those trees, but she hoped he never stopped doing it. A man from the feed store, the same one who used to snort into his coffee at the mention of Ostrowski's Firewood, bought 3 jars and asked, without a trace of the old smirk, whether he took orders for Christmas. The postman's wife came by twice. The schoolteacher came with her whole class, and the children lined up smaller and smaller behind their teacher's skirt, cups held out like they were waiting for communion. He said little through all of it. He nodded, he poured, he made change from a cigar box with hands that had gone steady after years of not needing to hurry. He did not smile the way a man smiles when he's won something, because winning had never been the plan. He only kept an eye, now and then, toward the far end of the fairground, where a man in a familiar canvas coat stood near the judging tent with his arms crossed, watching the river of people bend away from the fresh fruit table and toward the crooked little stand with the washtub press and the handwritten labels, and saying nothing at all. Kurt did not come closer. He stood where the crowd thinned near the judging tent, and he watched the way a man watches weather he can't stop, arms folded tight against his chest, as if that might hold something in. The big orchard's fresh fruit table sat behind him, its baskets neat and glossy under the September sun, apples stacked in pyramids nobody was buying. He had spent all spring telling that orchard's new owner how to prune, how to spray, how to do things right, and none of it had brought a single soul to stand in line the way they stood now, 3 deep and growing, in front of a stand made of scrap wood and an old washtub. A boy tugged his father's sleeve and pointed at the crooked press with its wagon wheel gears turning slow and steady, and asked how it worked, and the father said he didn't rightly know, only that it made the best cider he'd ever put in his mouth. Kurt heard that. He heard it more than once that afternoon, in different voices, from different mouths, all saying some version of the same thing, and each time it landed like a small stone dropped into a place already full of water. The veteran never looked over long. He had learned, in another life, that a man doesn't need to watch the enemy to know he's there. He only needs to keep doing the next right thing with his hands. So he poured. He wiped the rim of a jar with a clean rag before handing it across. He counted change into a boy's palm and told him to mind his mother. He answered the same questions about the trees with the same short, honest words: bad bark, good fruit, patience, because that was the whole truth, and there had never been any other kind he cared to tell. Near 4 o'clock, the line finally thinned, not from lack of people, but because the last jars were gone, and he turned the cigar box upside down and shook out the day's dust and folded the empty crates against the truck bed. Kurt was gone by then, slipped off sometime in the last hour without a word, the way men do when a thing has been proven and there's nothing left to argue. The old man looked once toward the empty spot where he'd stood, then back to his trees standing quiet at the far edge of the fairground in the wagon he'd hauled a few branches in for show, twisted and gray-barked and alive. He did not need anyone to say he'd been right. He had already known it, through the whole cold winter when no one else believed it, and knowing had always been enough.